Diana goes on to say in her email to me, she says, today, as my own therapist and I were looking at my depression in light of polyvagal theory, she was brainstorming ways to bring me back up the ladder, thinking through things I could do to re-regulate. However, I noticed lots of resistance to this. I was recognizing in myself a desire to stay in that shutdown space. We tried exploring what makes me want to stay there, but overall, I'm not really sure. I was wondering if you had insight into this. Diana goes on to say more, but I'm going to pause here and I want to talk about this. We're going to break this down. An impulse maybe has not been met yet. So when we have resistance to climbing the polyvagal ladder, there might be an impulse from our defensive state that we have not quite met yet. I'll talk about this a little bit more. Accepting shutdown or accepting defensive state activation is different than trying to get out of it. So we're accepting it versus trying to change it. If you're in a defensive state, that is okay. It's not necessarily a bad thing. If it's dysregulated defensive state, it's not bad. It's just, it is what it is. Ideally, we want to be in a state that is anchored enough in safety to where we can have maybe our stuck state be present or have some defensive activation, but we can tolerate it. That's completely okay. These states are not good or bad by themselves. They simply evolved within us to help us survive. There's no good or bad valuation to them. They might feel more good or more bad. You could put it that way, sure. But it really is what it is. It's simply true. You do have the state that you're in. That's true. And you can experience that, or you might be able to experience that if you have enough of the safety state activated at the same time. So if you're in a defensive state, okay, hey, whatever, it is what it is, and that's okay. Potentially it is okay. And you could also have more of a fuck it attitude. Fuck it might be fine too. It's the way I look at this is like it's happening anyways. If you can't get yourself out of it, like if you can't do that, okay, well, fuck it. It is what it is. I'm in my defensive state, and sometimes this comes up in therapy where that person is in a defensive state. They're acknowledging it, and they're like, I can't do anything about it. I'm trying to anchor myself in safety. I'm trying to climb my polyvagal ladder. I'm trying to cope or ground myself or self-regulate, and it is just persisting. At that point where to me, it's like, okay, hey, it is what it is. We better get some radical acceptance of this right now, and that might actually help us get to the next step. Now, I don't mean fuck it, like destroy everything. It's more like, fuck it, I got this. I can do it. It's happening anyways. I might as well embrace this and get to the next step. So there actually might be a little more fight energy in there. But it's not like it's out of control. Fuck it kind of. That's not what I'm saying. It's really more like our state's present anyway. There's no point in fighting. I don't want people fighting their polyvagal state. I think that does not help. I think that's probably going to keep you down your polyvagal ladder more than anything. So it's not about fighting the state. It's more about noticing it and accepting it, that it is what it is. It is true. It's just validating that it is there, that you do have these feelings, you do have these thoughts, whatever it is. So not fighting it, it's noticing it and accepting it. That's kind of the first step here when it comes to it. And then eventually becoming curious about it and actually experiencing it. Eventually. When we talk about like anchoring in safety or climbing the polyvagal ladder, but I want to focus more on anchoring in safety. That does not mean that we need to ignore or work against the defensive state that we're in. Quite the opposite. Honestly, when I am working with clients in therapy, what I try to get them to do is to mindfully notice that they have a stuck defensive state or maybe some activation in that moment, and that's okay. Can we allow it to be there? Can we actually maybe even invite it to be there if we're ready for that? But if it's there, can we allow it to be there and treat it with respect? And then can we also anchor ourselves in safety? It's not about getting rid of the defensive state. It's not about fighting it or ignoring it or minimizing it. It's allowing it to be there while also anchoring in safety. So anchoring does not mean we need to work against it or ignore it. Anchoring in safety does not mean you have no defensive state activation. And even climbing to the top of your polyvagal ladder does not necessarily mean that you have no defensive state activation. It just means you're anchored in safety. So whatever defensive state activation you have is not out of control. Being anchored is more like regulated. It's more about being regulated versus dysregulated. Dysregulated defensive state would be like you're actually fighting somebody. A regulated fight energy would be experienced as power and motivation. So it's anchoring in safety means that we're regulated, and there might be some defensive state activation there, and that's okay. And it actually might be necessary based on what's going on and where you're at in your trauma recovery. What I would recommend to you, dear listener, is that you don't try to get out of your defensive state. I know that's kind of the opposite, I think, of what we hear when it comes to trauma recovery and people that talk about polyvagal theory states and whatnot, is that the goal is somehow to get out of the defensive state. And that's not the goal. You're in a defensive state for a reason. And you might be stuck in a defensive state for a reason. So fighting against that seems almost disrespectful to me, to yourself. So it's not about trying to get out of your defensive state. It's more about accepting it. It is what it is. Validate yourself. And maybe if you can, normalize it. Give yourself that normalization of like, hey, I feel this way for a reason. A valid reason, a true reason. It's not made up. So if you could accept it, maybe even normalize it. If you can validate it and normalize it, that might help you accept it. And then anchor in safety. And then, if you can successfully anchor in safety, then return your awareness to that defensive state. But hopefully it'll be more from a mindfully curious, anchored state, a regulated state. And if you can do that, then listen to the sensations and the impulses that are under the emotion of whatever defensive state that you exist in. And this is where we come back to those impulses. Acting on the impulse that may be under the feelings that you're going through, the emotions. If you act on the impulse mindfully, that may allow, it probably will allow, some ladder climbing to happen. So that process that I just laid out very briefly, that process is a hell of a lot different than feeling some like depressive shutdown kind of stuff and then saying, I don't like this, what's wrong with me? I better climb my way out of this and up my polyvagal ladder. If you can do that, cool, go ahead. But I don't think it's that simple. And I think that there needs to be some level of, hey, this is just where I'm at. This is simply what I feel, and that's okay. It is what it is. You don't have to like it. You don't have to like it. It's not about that. It's just more about accepting this is where I'm at. This is how I feel, and I probably feel this way for a reason. But to be able to do all this stuff, you do have to be anchored in your safety state first. When it comes to this process that I'm talking about, that I just kind of laid out, building safety anchors I designed that for anchoring, for accessing your safety state. In BSA, I don't teach you how to feel your defensive state, and it's not about getting rid of it. I don't think I voiced that whatsoever in the course. It's simply about anchoring in safety and building the strength of your safety state. Unstucking defensive states, my other course, or my third course in my system, UDS is about actively feeling the defensive state from an anchored safety state. So UDS is for feeling the defensive state actively and then allowing the natural ladder climbing to happen. You can go to my website, justinlmft.com, for more information on my courses. This podcast is not therapy, not intended to be therapy or be a replacement for therapy. Nothing in this creates or indicates a therapeutic relationship. Please consult with your therapist or seek for one in your area if you are experiencing mental health symptoms. Nothing in this podcast should be construed to be specific life advice. It is for educational and entertainment purposes only. More resources are available in the description of this episode and in the footer of justinlmft.com.